Well, good evening and welcome to the Connecticut Mirror's legislative session wrap-up. I'm John Dankosky. I'm the host of the Steady Habits podcast, and I'm thrilled to have you here with us as we talk about the end of a very important, big legislative session. It was a strange legislative session in a lot of ways, and we'll be talking about what got done, what didn't get done, and what we can expect for the future of Connecticut coming out of this session with our panelists tonight. And with us is Mark Pazniokas. He's the Capitol Bureau Chief of the Connecticut Mirror. Hello once again, Paz. Good to see you.
Good evening. Good to see you, John.
Also with us is Keith Phaneuf. He's the state budget reporter, the state budget guru, the Obi-Wan Kenobi of the state budget. Keith, always good to see you. Thank you so much for being here.
Likewise.
And Jan Ellen Spiegel, the environmental reporter for the Connecticut Mirror. Jan, good to see you as well. Thanks so much.
Pleasure to be here.
So there's a lot to cover, and I'm sure that the folks who are in our viewing audience will have some questions. And what I'd ask you to do is you can look in the bottom of your Zoom screen. Everyone knows how Zoom works now, right? You can use a chat if you want to ask questions back and forth. That chat's a good way to maybe have a little bit of a conversation on the side of what's happening. But if you do have a question for our panelists, please use the Q&A function. So go to the bottom of your screen and just click on Q&A, and you can type your question in there. And we will get to as many of those questions throughout the course of our program as possibly can. Once again, we'll look at things in the chat field as well. We've got a lot to cover. And what I'll do first is, before I dig in deeply with any of our panelists on some of the big bills, the topics that they've been covering for the last couple of months, I just want to get some quick thoughts and reflections. And Paz, maybe I'll start with you. I mean, what's the one big takeaway? If someone looks at you and says, what's something that happened during the session that you're going to remember for a long time, or that was really important? What would you tell them?
That would have to be the scramble at the end on how social equity licenses would work for legalized cannabis. There was a lot of behind the scenes brinkmanship, efforts to figure out how to provide access to this new industry on the behalf of people who are from areas that were disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. But it got very intense, and I have to say it got very personal. And instead of doing my standard legislative wrap-up at the end, I really spent days just looking at that. It nearly derailed this legalization effort, really, when it was just at the finish line, which would have been extraordinary. And it was a little disconcerting for a lot of the advocates, because the biggest impact of legalizing cannabis is really the erasure of records of thousands and thousands of people who have arrests for marijuana, as well as avoiding people being arrested in the future for marijuana. And instead, the focus was, again, on who's going to profit from this. And it got pretty hairy at the end. So that right now, and granted, it's fresh, it's top of mind, but I think that's the thing that's going to stick with me. That and the fact that, Connecticut is we're full on with cannabis, sports betting, online casino gambling. So this is all a little startling, given when I arrived in Connecticut, you couldn't buy a six-pack on Good Friday.
Yeah, Connecticut, it's changed a little bit, hasn't it? Yeah, we'll dig into that just a little bit. And of course, Mark was there for the marijuana bill signing today. There's an awful lot to talk about there, to talk about in sports betting. Keith, how about you? I mean, top line here, what was the big takeaway from this session?
Thought about this, John. You might describe it as what did happen, or you might describe it as what didn't happen. I see the glass as half full. And that was the tax fairness debate in, not just in the land of steady habits, but to put it bluntly, in the hedge fund state, in the state with this type of wealth and these types of pockets of poverty that has dodged this issue for so long. When you consider the more than robust tax fairness debate that went on, that challenged, I would argue, a fiscally conservative Democratic governor, that normally would never have gone on. At the same time, about $6 billion in federal money was pouring into the state. The most progressive of progressives would have said, this isn't the time, we don't need to talk about it, we have this federal money. I don't think you'd have seen the debate that we saw this year, were it not for what happened over the last 12 to 18 months, the pandemic, Black Lives Matter. You've seen something that, even though the inroads the progressive movement made, if you look at the finished product, might appear to be small, I think we're substantial. And I think it's something that's going to continue to press Governor Lamont and the legislature in the very near future, as in the next 2 years.
Yeah, I'm going to want to pick that up, especially as we look ahead to some of the political ramifications of that. And let me turn to you, Jan. I mean, the biggest thing that you covered is a thing that didn't get done, but I'll let you take it away in terms of the things that did or didn't get done in the beat that you cover, the real big takeaway for you from this session.
Well, the thing that didn't get done is absolutely it. It was a stunning meltdown of what environmentalists called the biggest climate change legislation in years that would have helped lower transportation emissions in this Transportation and Climate Initiative. And the way it was portrayed by the opposition in what I would call almost a Trumpian manner, put out what you want to say, and that was the notion that this was a gas tax, which it is not. And the environmental community and the governor's office and everyone else just could not combat that. And something that was kind of a given. I mean, this was just enabling legislation. It wasn't like there were any details. It was just, okay, we're going to hit the start button now. That's it. And everybody at the start really thought, oh, this is a no-brainer. Well, it was definitely not a no-brainer. It subsumed everything else. And there was an interesting group of initiatives that did get through and almost got lost in the shuffle. Along with the bottle bill, a bunch of other things pertaining to how we're going to fix the waste system. So there was a bit of a yin yang there, but TCI, Transportation Climate Initiative, without a doubt, that was the big one.
Yeah, we'll get back to that in just a little bit too. And some of these waste bills, which is a big issue in Connecticut as well. Well, let's turn once again. I will just tell all of our viewers here, if you have questions, we're already starting to get some in the Q&A field. Please feel free to get them to us. We'll answer as many as we possibly can. Well, Mark, let's go back to earlier today. The marijuana law gets passed. As of today, in July, marijuana is legal in effect in Connecticut, but we're not going to really have a retail sales system set up until sometime late 2022, if even then. Maybe you can just flesh out exactly what Connecticut has signed and what is still to come, because one of the biggest arguments for marijuana legalization has been, we're going to set up some sort of a marketplace here. We're going to be able to tax it and compete with states like Massachusetts that are selling it all over the place and putting up billboards in Connecticut saying, drive north and buy your weed. We're not going to have anything like a marketplace anytime soon.
No, we're not. So to break it down simply, on July 1, you can legally possess 1.5 ounces of marijuana on your person, and up to 5 ounces if it's secured in your home or locked in your car. So that alone will be a significant change for people. It's gonna change how police interact, with all kinds of folks. A couple of things. It doesn't change the clean air laws. It doesn't change the smoking laws. Places where smoking is banned, you shouldn't be lighting up a joint either. So state parks, they will be banned. This bill actually expands smoking prohibitions. Hotels will be banned from offering smoking rooms. There are going to be further restrictions on smoking in or around the workplace. So, that's kind of an interesting aspect to this that didn't get a lot of attention. But the stuff that's going to take longer to develop is going to be, first of all, the governor and legislative leaders have got to appoint people to a 15-member social equity council. And they're going to have a lot of work to do. They're going to have to hire somebody to conduct a study about really looking at the extent to which illegal cannabis industry should and can be an instrument to adjust racial and economic injustice. There's a regulatory structure that has to be put together at the Department of Consumer Protection. And the licensing will take time. The expectation is that there will be a deluge. The 4 commercial producers in the medical marijuana business, if they're willing to write a check for $3 million each, they can convert their licenses to also produce recreational marijuana. And clearly they've been geared up for that. One of the producers, has quadrupled its space in recent years. So, they're certainly gearing up for that. But it's going to be end of 2022 before there's really a market. And then for the folks who are dying to do homegrown, you're going to have to wait till July of 2023, unless you're one of the 54,000 or so folks who have a medical marijuana card. You'll be able to grow your own in October, assuming you can find seeds or suitable cloning plant material.
The racial and economic justice piece of it is, as you mentioned at the top, some of the biggest hangups. You talked about that debate getting very, very personal, and there's a lot to unpack in there. I mean, one piece of it is that other states that have legalized have had some of these same troubles. We know that in Massachusetts, they've been trying to make social equity a piece of how they give out licenses, how they make sure that people are producing. It hasn't necessarily come to fruition because the capital isn't always there. It can be very hard to ramp up. Maybe you can just take us through that piece of it, because that's one of the most important parts of this legislation, and one of the reasons why, one of the sticking points really, in why it took so long to get done.
Half of the licenses, and there are licenses for all level of this, cultivation on a major level, micro cultivators, packagers, people who are going to be licensed to transport the marijuana, as well as licensed to sell it at retail. And half of the licenses for all levels are going to be reserved for social equity applicants. Social equity applicants will be people who are from, they either grew up in or have lived for a significant amount of time in a census tract that has been disproportionately impacted by cannabis arrest and other metrics. And that's going to be up to the Social Equity Council. We don't know precisely what those census tracts are, but there'll be a great benefit for those folks, and that they'll kind of go to the front of the line as far as getting their applications reviewed. But what we don't know is how many licenses will there be? To what extent will the state be able to encourage joint ventures between social equity applicants and major business interests? You have the need for capital, you have the need for expertise. And so that's really, I think, going to be the continuing story for the next year or so, is how good a job does Connecticut do at encouraging that, of promoting that kind of thing. The track record in other states is not great. Anytime where you set things like this up, there's always, the abuses that go on, where somebody ends up as a front for somebody who's got a lot of money, and it's a way to short circuit the process. So I think, you're going to see a lot of stories like that as to who is getting these licenses, what partnerships do they put together. Then the other piece of it is, ultimately, when the revenue starts coming in, it's where will that revenue be spent? 3/4 of it is supposed to go to addressing social equity issues. It's not just going to go into the general fund. It's not going to just go into funding for municipal aid. It's supposed to be specific stuff. And then the other 25%, it's supposed to be for preventative work on drug abuse and addiction.
I think a lot of people would look at that and say, yeah, but I mean, a million years ago, Connecticut benefited, along with a lot of other states, from just billions of dollars in tobacco settlement money that was supposed to be spent in a very specific way. And it's just one of many ways in which Connecticut gets money that is supposed to be spent in a very specific way, and then it is later not spent in that way? What are the safeguards put in place by this legislation that indeed it's going to go where it's supposed to go?
There is no prohibition on one legislature undoing the works of a previous legislature. So whatever, unless you stick it in the Constitution, or if you figure out something clever like volatility caps or whatnot, spending caps, any legislature can, the magic word in the General Assembly is notwithstanding. Notwithstanding anything that's ever been done before, this is what we're doing now. And that's how you see a lot of bills begin. So no, there's no guarantee, but I think it will be the social and political pressure to go down this route for a while. Now, the temptation in Connecticut has always been you run into a bad budget situation, and that's when these funds get diverted. One of the funds that when Connecticut got into gambling with the tribes, the Pequot Mohegan Fund. I mean, that started out as really taking a lot of the slots revenue from municipal aid.
Mm-hmm.
And then over the years, it was less and less and less used for that purpose, and more and more and more that went into the general fund.
Well, and this is a good transition to Keith here. And Keith, just very quickly, a lot of people over the years, as we've talked about the issue of, marijuana legalization, they've said, well, we're going to solve the state's budget problems, legalize weed, and that's going to solve all the problems because we'll have this flow of money coming in here. So, I mean, granted, we're not going to have this marketplace open until at least the end of next year, but just give a quick reality check on that, Keith, for us. If you
would. Just I that's probably the most important thing, John. I mean, it's all about perspective. We can sit here and talk about, hey, could marijuana in the first year bring in $40 million and get up to 60 million or maybe even 70 million a year in the scope of a $22 billion budget in a state that has $91 billion in long-term unfunded liabilities. We're talking about a drop in a drop in a drop of a bucket. It doesn't mean it's not worth debating, but there's no marijuana taxation system that could solve the state's problems, even if the money were going into the general fund, as opposed to, as Paz laid out, going into the heavily affected communities and a certain extent into healthcare initiatives. I also just wanted to respond to just one other thing you and Paz were talking about. It's the only thing that Paz said that I semi don't agree with, and that was when he said, maybe if something's safe and maybe if you put it in the Constitution. I know he was just being facetious. Even then, it's not safe. There is no pocket of money that the legislature can't get at if they want. If you really want to make sure, like the tobacco settlement money, which just totally props up the general fund, it is not earmarked in any substantial amount for healthcare initiatives at all. If you really want to make sure your compass is working correctly, you don't have to get a new compass. You've got to get rid of the magnet that's sitting right next to it that's pulling it off course. In this case, it's our pension debt. When we've got our pension debt under control, the legislature will stop raiding every other source of money under the sun to deal with it.
Well, to that point, we got a question here from Scott, who says, do you think the governor of the General Assembly will tackle pension reform before the 2022 election?
Yeah, the short answer I wrote to Scott was no, unfortunately. And I assumed, by the way, what Scott meant was not necessarily restructuring payments, which we do left and right now. That's become a new form of just deferring pension contributions. But if you're saying you think you need to see the benefits that are paid out scaled back, I don't see the Democratic majority in the legislature or the governor or another Democrat touching that with a 10-foot pole between now and election day.
So one thing I wanted to talk to you about, Keith, is that it seems kind of remarkable that coming out of this pandemic, in which it just seemed like doom and gloom, we had businesses closing, we had hundreds of thousands of people out of work. Connecticut seems to have come out of this problem in pretty good fiscal shape, at least for now. So I'll ask you for another reality check on that. I mean, how real is this moment for Connecticut where we have this record-setting rainy day fund? It seems as though our tax receipts are coming in. We're getting a lot of money from Wall Street. Are we in as good a financial health at the end of this legislative session as it looks like?
We talked about this at a couple of staff meetings, and I said, if we could, with apologies to Dickens, if we could title this, the worst of times, the best of times. We are right now enjoying some really high quality fiscal Novocaine. And that is what's numbing all the pain that's going on right now. We had, since the pandemic began, basically a 30% jump in the stock market. You didn't just have the bull market of all bull markets. You have federal unemployment relief, which has actually kept our state income tax receipts tied to paycheck withholding flat. And just to give you some perspective, they should be way down. We lost 120,000 jobs in the Great Recession of 2007 to 2010. At the height of the pandemic, we were down 390,000 jobs. As of last week, we still had about 170,000 people getting weekly unemployment benefits. But yet, and people forget most of those benefits they're getting, including the federal additions, that's subject to taxation. That is what's keeping our coffers afloat. That is the Novocaine, that along with the bull market that's been going on. When the federal money runs out and when the unemployment benefits expire, and with our luck, that's when a bear market will occur at the same time. There is a plunge that's coming. The problem is we still don't know exactly how bad it is, but what we do know is the underlying economic indicators are still very weak. We saw, and I'll just wrap with this point, when Fred Carstensen at UConn comes out with a study that says it could take us 10 years to recover from the pandemic. And our best bet to do that is to put every penny of federal money not into the state budget, but into the economy, which we didn't do. And then a week later, his economic polar opposite, Don Kleppersmith, who was Jody Rell's chief economic advisor, comes out and says, Fred Carstensen is right on. And our gross state product is in the tank. I think you can find that pretty much in Revelation. When Carstensen and Kleppersmith agree, it's time to get your affairs in order. We're in trouble.
Here come the locusts.
That's so.
And look, and Jan Ellen Spiegel will tell you, the planet is warming up. The cicadas are coming out even sooner than every 17 years now, right, Jan? I mean, it's the plague times. It's the end of days. We'll get back to Keith's doom and gloom sermon in just a moment. So Jan, this transportation and climate initiative plan, important to note, as you say, this was not like summed up in it's a gas tax. This was a much bigger plan that was meant to cut emissions. It was also part of a regional strategy. It's part of a big national movement. I think one thing that's interesting about this is that unlike things like marijuana legalization, sports betting, and other things that we've seen widely adopted now by other states, and Connecticut's almost coming up from behind in this. The TCI is a regional plan, but it wasn't widely adopted by all the states. And did that have something to do with why this didn't get more traction in Connecticut?
Well, first, I'm going to correct you there in the terminology of widely adopted. We are not at that phase yet. And there was vast amounts of misinformation out there and some horribly awful reporting. I mean, I saw stuff out there where did this come from? It helps to give a little perspective on this. And by the way, before I forget, there were locusts in Africa, so we're there, guys. Think back to the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which actually has been on the books since about 2008. It was designed to reduce emissions from power plants. A lot easier to do. Power plants just sit there. you put a carbon charge on them, and actually ratepayers in this state do pay a little more for their power and always have as a result of that. And it has reduced emissions quite a bit. A lot of reasons for that, but not the least of it is just that charge. And it has brought in, over the states involved, something north of $4 billion in those years. That was a climate initiative. The Transportation and Climate Initiative was conceived of over 10 years ago to do the exact same thing with transportation. No one was sitting around saying, oh, we can get more money for the transportation fund. It was always a climate plan, and oh, hey, we can get some money out of it because we've shown this works. And there is a model to base it on, in that California has kind of a cap and trade system, not dissimilar from either of these. And they're in effect, their power sector went on first. A couple of years later, the transportation sector came on, and they wrestled with a lot of the issues that come up in transportation versus power, which is that transportation cuts across all sectors. And again, you're going to have to make some accounting for the economic equity in the social justice community, because if you can't afford a new car that is going to replace your 20-year-old gas guzzler out in California, you're driving some ancient tractor out on the farm, the slight increase in gas prices that will be part of this could hurt you. So there was always massive amounts of thought about what you do about this. And that is what was seized on as being this quote unquote gas tax. In terms of adopting it, this has been a multi-stage process. The same way RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, was a multi-stage process. Some states came in at the beginning, some states came on later. New Jersey famously got out. They got a new governor, they got back in. Virginia's in, North Carolina's getting in. This is all, Pennsylvania's getting in. This is all under RGGI. This was at a phase where the facilitators of TCI were looking at how are we going to structure this broadly. And if you sign on to this broad structure, then you can move to the next stage and come up with a very state-specific plan, which is exactly how RGGI worked. Each of the states had state-specific plans, and they came on when they were ready. And late last year, 3 states and DC, among the 12 states or so that have been part of this, said, okay, we're ready. We would like to go put our plan together. Connecticut and Rhode Island happen to have a system where you need enabling legislation, as I said before, that says, okay, ready, set, go. You can now start figuring this plan out. And that enabling legislation, not any details of the plan, that enabling legislation is what didn't make it through. And just as a side note, there's discussion about now what do we do, but that has not been determined yet. All the other states are still in this. They didn't get out. Any of those headlines that you saw that said only 3 states left, not true, not even close to true. All the other states are still working on this, and when they're ready to get in, they will get in and start dealing with their plan.
And one way to think about it is Connecticut's not out of it. They just haven't set up the
Not at all.
implementation of it, right? And this is important. Keith, I know that you want to jump in on this real quick.
Thanks, John. Real quickly, what really sank TCI, and I agree with everything Jan said, just in addition, it was a weird political coalition of the far right and the far left. The people you'd expect to oppose TCI because they saw it as a tax hike did. But the people on the far left who were very frustrated that Governor Lamont would not support larger tax breaks for the poor and for the middle class said, well, then fine. If we can't talk about that type of tax relief, we're not going to talk about tax cuts. And the TCI sort of fell victim to that. It was a weird coalition.
I didn't really get that sense, honestly. There was one group that sort of backed off a little, but the bulk of the left-leaning environmental groups, um, they were on board. They wanted it badly, very, very,
But they
very
were in the
badly.
negotiations with the governor, Jan. It was the leadership on the left, people like Senator Looney
Okay, yeah,
said,
okay.
well, if we're not talking taxes, we're not raising gas taxes on poor residents. I think Senator Looney likes the TCI. He didn't like Governor Lamont's lack of flexibility on tax relief for the poor
And
and
some
middle
of the
class.
active labor unions were not helpful to TCI. You know, there was a one day where there were a bunch of TCI activists outside the Capitol, as well as SEIU, who represent, low income a lot of low income workers in the service industry and nursing homes. And the two groups were talking, and the union guys normally would be with them, but on this one they said, no, we can't. We view it as less than progressive as far as the potential impact on gasoline prices. So I think Keith's right on that one, that it was a confluence of things that just didn't work. And then you also have the hangover from 2019, where tolls really left an impression. That campaign for passage of highway tolls was so poorly handled by the Lamont administration in its early months. And that really did, I think, rattle people. And I think there's a little bit of hangover, whether it's fair or unfair, that is kind of splashed onto TCI.
Well, there were a
Go
couple of
Jan.
there are a couple of pieces of that. The the core of the opposition also, to some degree, inferred that this was all designed because tolls had failed and we're gonna get our money this way, when in fact this has been in the works for, as I said, over 10 years. The other thing, in terms of labor and some of the folks, the more liberal wing in the legislature, was there was this real lack of understanding what was going on. And I always sort of want to take a broad view, in that this was, as often happens in the Connecticut legislature, viewed very narrowly in the short term to say that it's going to cost us money. The long view of what reducing emissions can do to save you money down the road, it just never sees the light of day. The notion that it might have some impact on healthcare costs because of a reduction in asthma, or save you commuting time because people will maybe get off the road because they don't want to be paying that extra money. That long-term sense is just so often absent, and it was absent this time.
Yeah, as Keith often talks about, the long-term view about Connecticut's future is something that lawmakers very rarely take up. Hang on for 1 second, Jan, because I just want to, since we were talking about labor a little bit, Paz, I mean, what kind of a session was it for labor interests?
It was a very good year overall. They didn't get everything they wanted, but quite frankly, they wanted a lot. The biggest failure was probably would be considered as the predictive work week, something that's very important to lower wage workers who cobble together 2, maybe even 3 part-time jobs. And they're the ones who tend to get screwed over when they get a last minute shift change, and it kind of upends childcare, it upends transportation, as well as their other jobs. So that went through the Senate, never came up in the House, but there were a bunch of things, some of which were tucked into the budget implementer bill that I'm sure this audience has read something about. And there were some things in there. There was a protection bill for domestic workers, something that had been talked about for a number of years. There's another bill that was separate, which has to do with disclosure of salary ranges. The governor has not signaled, as far as I know, whether he's going to sign that, but that did go through. And that is considered something that could really be, level the playing field, particularly for women entering the workforce, where you can't see some of the historic inequities in salary ranges. Overall, it was a pretty good year for labor, including in the cannabis bill. Advocates did get in language where it's called a labor peace agreement, that basically it kind of tilts things towards union organizers to a certain degree. By the way, there was another bill that passed that is certainly a help to public sector workers retaining their influence. This was something that was passed in reaction to the Janus court decision, which upended what had been the convention for years and years and years, which was if you're a public sector employee, you didn't join a union, you would pay a fee for basically the benefits you were getting based off of the contracts that unions had negotiated. And since that was overturned by the US Supreme Court, there was an effort in the state legislature to, in their view, level the playing field. Now, certainly municipal governments do not view it as the playing field being leveled. They viewed it as being tilted. They think public sector unions in Connecticut are powerful enough. Thank you very much.
So Keith, I want to get back to something you raised at the top. I mean, it came up in what Paz was just talking about. It certainly came up in the conversation Jan was having about TCI. This larger tax fairness debate in the state. We, amongst the many things that happened over the course of this pandemic, we saw the state come out in pretty good fiscal health, but we saw the billionaires of the state and of the country come out in really good fiscal health. And so I think it just amped up this call from an awful lot of folks in the states to say, we need to figure out a way to make a tax structure that is a little bit fair. How far did people get in that conversation? Where did it land by the end of the session?
Thank you. I want to clarify something I said earlier, because I saw in the chats a question from Bill Finch about, based on my comment that they did well. I just want to clarify. I don't think they did well if you look at the finished product. They certainly didn't get the majority of what they shot for. However, the level of debate they had, the intensity of it, the amount of time everything stayed in play, and coupled with what they did get, it simply was a more robust debate than I've seen in more than a decade. We did come away not just by increasing the state earned income tax credit, the tax credit for the working poor. We did get not only a significant increase in pilot money, but we actually did a workaround. We got Governor Lamont to accept a partial workaround of the spending cap to make sure they could get that. And they stuck with the existing schedule to increase the education cost sharing system. So there were some gains. That said, the fact that we were talking right up until the end about, well, is there something we can do in terms of a capital gains surcharge on the wealthy? Even though everybody knew Governor Lamont was going to fight that thing, I don't think you would have seen the bonding that we saw for the urban communities, about $175 million a year for 5 years, if we hadn't already played that card, John Fonfara's card, saying, I want to do 2 income tax surcharges on the rich, one on their capital gains and also this idea of a consumption tax. If they hadn't tossed out there the idea of a digital media ads tax and had the Speaker of the House, Matt Ritter, who's generally been the one helping the governor get his way, saying, hey, this digital media ads tax makes a lot of sense to me. I think they forced Governor Lamont to kill the things he was most afraid of. He was going to have to give ground like he hadn't before. And the fact that, quite frankly, many in the progressive camp are still ticked off, still feel that all the talk that we heard last summer about Black Lives Matter was not backed up with substance, is why I called this debate still a success.
We're going to add some more questions in just a moment. You can ask your questions in the Q&A field if you have them. please go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and type them in, and we'll try to get to a few of them in just a second. Jan, at the top of the program, you were talking about a few things that got done, things that didn't get done. One piece of it, of course, had to do with TCI and climate change, but there was a lot of, well, let's just call it waste that was part of this legislative session. What got done in terms of the way we get rid of the stuff we don't need anymore?
Um, a trajectory to changing a broader system got started. And I think you have to remember that in the height of the pandemic, with the main trash to energy plant, ready, it was just called off entirely. It's just not going to exist in any form that we know. Katie Dykes, the commissioner of the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, pulled together over about a 3-month period, which is pretty compressed, several dozen municipal leaders, other leaders, and they talked trash. 4 working groups, and they really worked through sort of how you reform the system, what goes first, what goes second, what's the order of how you do things. And some of those pieces got put in place. The overall notion is that you get the stuff out that you don't want going to a burn plant, or you don't want going into a landfill. So they tightened up the food waste requirements that this state has. And that's always considered, get the food waste out of the trash. It weighs a lot. So if you're paying to have it dumped, it's going to cost you more. If you're burning it, it doesn't burn, it's wet. And so the amount of food waste certain institutions create, if they are within 20 miles of a facility that can deal with it, that amount has gone down. They cut it in half. So more entities will have to do that. They didn't increase the mileage, which there was a move to get it to 30 miles, which would have really pulled in more. They didn't add some things to the mix of what would have to do it, especially educational institutions, although a lot of universities do it already. But that was a step to getting the food waste out.
And explain again quickly, if you would, about the 30 miles. What do you mean?
If you are within 20 miles of some sort of composting facility, whether it's an anaerobic digester or outdoor composting, you have to get your food waste in. If you're among a certain category of businesses, you have to get rid of your food waste that way. The goal was, the administration more or less wanted to increase that to 30 miles, which would make folks have to travel further. And there was a lot of pushback on that. So that never got through. But there's going to be more food waste, at least from the commercial sector, not going into the trash. So that's number one. Another big one was, after years and years and years and years, the bottle bill will be updated. Again, this is a way you get stuff out of the trash that you don't want in the trash. And it was all kinds of stuff were getting into the recycling bin that was making recycling more difficult to deal with. So in a couple of years, there will be a lot more bottles that are going to be able to be returned. The price will go up, which will incentivize people presumably to actually get their money back as opposed to stick it in the blue bin. There is money behind that and the food waste component and the waste system broadly to begin some pilot projects to figure out how you're going to handle all this. And on the bottle bill front, there's some really interesting models out on the West Coast. Oregon, for example, does some really interesting things with how they get rid of their bottles. Whether Connecticut will get that creative and not just, let's clean up the redemption centers, I don't know. They did one other thing that kind of snuck through that a lot of people didn't notice. One of the things with recycling that Connecticut has not done that many other states in the region do is figure out a way to deal with use recycled content, which would in turn spur companies to begin to process that kind of stuff. Pennsylvania has dozens of companies that do that kind of thing because they have mandates on using recycled content. We've had a very small paper recycled content mandate within government, which has never been enforced. And the legislation that went through said, okay, DEP, we want you to start figuring out ways we can use recycled content so we can build businesses around it. One of the waste bills didn't go through that would basically increase the types of companies that are responsible for their own end of life product. We do it in this state already with mattresses. We do it with paint. One of the big ones that was in the legislation that failed would have been tires, and that's huge. So that did make it through. But you can see the trajectory. Let's start getting all this stuff out of the waste so we can start looking at the bigger picture from a reasonable standpoint. And in the meantime, loads of towns are beginning to experiment with this stuff on their own. So the movement is in that direction.
I want to get to some of the questions that people are asking. Lisa asks, I'm trying to discover what bills were passed that will affect the lives of people with disabilities, both for students and young adults. I know of Bill 6121 and the Education Bundle 945. Disability groups are not good at publicizing change, but I run a very large family group looking for what has changed. Mark, you want to take a crack at answering Lisa's question?
I wish I could. Lisa, I read your question. I made a note that it's something that we didn't view as a standalone story. And it's a great idea of looking at a session through the eyes of a disability community. You know, our friend Kathy Flaherty will bring things to our attention from time to time. But I can't answer your question right now, but I will try to do so in the future with a story.
Speaking of Kathy Flaherty, she asks, what's going to happen to human services and social services when the federal dollars run out? Will folks be willing to raise necessary revenue then, or will we just go back to austerity and cutting? Keith?
Well, I'm not going to give you my typical cheery answer, John. We will really, it's funny, I was just typing an answer to one of our viewers on the fiscal cliff. That's what it's going to come down to. If 2 years from now, when the federal money, maybe it all evaporates, maybe Congress weans us off it and they give us a little bit more. But the point is, if the jobs have not come back, we will be having that debate. So it depends on who you want to bet on. What, you know, I mean, we haven't so far as a state wanted to reform taxes when it's been raining out or when it's been sunny out. I think the chances are better that 2 years from now it will be raining. So if you like your odds better in a gloomier year, in the past, it's always been, well, times are tough and we shouldn't be raising taxes on anyone. That's why I thought this year's debate was significant, because you can argue it's raining out or it's sunny out right now, depending on if you're a billionaire or if you're unemployed. But I think that the very fact that the folks who feel we need tax reform are beginning to get angrier in larger numbers leads me to think there will be some push. We carved out, for example, some money this year for the nonprofit social services, some additional funds. But at the last minute, Governor Lamont committed a big chunk of that money to help avert the group home strike that was worked into the budget. So a lot of the extra money for nonprofits is just going to go to nonprofits that contract with the Department on Developmental Services. There's still a lot of work to be done in that area. I'm sorry, it's really hard to say, but I will say, while some gains were made, they could easily slip back if we're not committed to keeping them and potentially raising taxes in 2 years.
And again, as you were writing to the person who was asking the question, Robert, and as you've talked a little bit about, the fiscal cliff that is looming is something that dominates so much of what you write about. And despite, as we say, some of the sunny news that we have from a fiscal standpoint in the state at the moment, this is something that we can't look away from, lest we go over the edge.
Well, look at it this way, John. We needed a decade after the Great Recession to recover about 80% of 120,000 lost jobs. We never got all of them back. Governor Malloy would always point out, well, we got back all of the private sector jobs, but the bottom line is that's still not a great track record. We lost 390,000 in this pandemic. And we've probably still got anywhere, depending on your estimates, as much as 160 or 170,000 jobs to replace. That's something that's going to, again, based on our track record, take years. If you believe Fred Carstenson's projection, 10 years. We just haven't experienced the revenue loss from that yet.
And, Paz, Gary Winfield, the state senator, just to type to us, this year's debate isn't going to go anywhere. It will only continue. This year demonstrated that there is a lot of work to be done, and people are ready to do that work to make sure these conversations continue. Mark, I think one of the things that's so fascinating about the state and the way that it has to grapple with all these problems, we're talking about the issues that Keith has outlined so well about the looming fiscal crisis that we have. We have just very clear, very stark inequities and unfairness in the way that people live in the state. That is obvious. We have a state that has an awful lot of great natural resources. We want to do right by the environment. We sometimes put those things first, as Jan has said. We sometimes put those things second. I don't know, Mark, it just seems like there's a lot of things that people are going to be continuing to, I don't know if the word is fight about over the course of the next couple of years, but it feels as though a lot of these questions are really coming to a head. I mean, what sort of state do we want to be? How fair do we want to be in terms of the people who live here and the types of services we provide?
Well, there are cross currents to this discussion. You have to acknowledge that Connecticut is guilty of incredible mismanagement of its pension, and for a time, the debts that were accumulated. And Connecticut's paying a price for that. Benefits were very generous at one point, and the state was not paying its actuarially required contribution every year. And so Connecticut sort of woke up in the last 10 years to the fact that the pension costs were eating up more and more and more of the general fund budget every year. So there's that. Connecticut was really bruised very badly by all these national ratings of business environment. Now, some of them are highly political. Some of them will mark down Connecticut simply because it's not a right to work state. But others, I think, certainly reflect Connecticut's history of fiscal mismanagement that goes back decades and decades and decades. Governor Lamont clearly is very sensitive to how Connecticut is playing on Wall Street, in C-suites and beyond. He's gotten a couple of favorable Wall Street Journal editorials, which have not been written about Connecticut's management style in a long, long time. There have been some modest upgrades in bond ratings, but modest though they may be, they are unprecedented over, I guess, the past decade or more, right, Keith? But
that's correct.
So you have that. You have this sense that Connecticut has got to get its house in order. And then you have these very real needs. And the conflict that you see in Connecticut is some of this stuff, quite frankly, would be better addressed by Congress. But the progressives who are trying to address these gross inequities, Congress is not a good place to play. It hasn't been for a long time, but Connecticut is for the left. The left can elect people, can do things like first the 10-10 minimum wage and now the $15 minimum wage, and as well as paid family and medical leave, those kinds of things that do contribute to this national debate. So, I mean, that's where Connecticut struggles. There are real needs. The money that Keith mentioned, I mean, that was a shock to the nonprofits. They thought they finally had some money socked aside that was going to go to reimbursements for some of these programs. And then last second, it was, a bunch of it went to settle the strike. And as the nonprofit association said, they were in a very awkward position. They said, these people deserve the money, but the rest of our clients do too. So they've done a stopgap with some federal ARPA money, but that's only a stopgap. That doesn't go to changing, rate increases for some of these programs, Medicaid programs that pay for some of these services. I'm sorry, I'm as much of a downer as Keith tonight,
Well, just, one thing on the bond rating, and I'm not trying to pick on the ratings agencies, but I think sometimes reporters forget what they're rating is the state's ability to repay its bond investors. That's an important priority, but it's not the only one state government has. In other words, Wall Street doesn't care. How are you taking care of your poor? How are you taking care of your disabled? How are you're sick? They're simply rating how are you taking care of your bond investors. It's an important
that's fair to say, Keith.
Not everything.
Well, and that's why when Paz talks about, it's Governor Lamont feels good about getting positive Wall Street Journal op-eds written. That's fine, and it plays well some places. That's not something that plays well in an awful lot of other places and an awful lot of kitchens across the state. Let me just quickly go to a couple more questions here that we have. Ted Lowenthal asks, the death with dignity law got further than ever, came out of committee, then got sent to the Judiciary Committee and died there. Why, he asks, polls show broad support. Any thoughts?
Yeah, there's a thing called bandwidth. It's not just your cell phone. It's the ability of the legislature to do so many controversial things at once. They did gambling, they did cannabis, they flirted with public option, ultimately didn't do it. The death with dignity one is always a difficult one for the legislature. It does hit some very sympathetic groups against each other. And we talked about the disability earlier. I think for certain able-bodied people who have always felt a certain degree of control over their lives, the death with dignity issue is an easy one. It's a no-brainer. I want that ability. But for people who have struggled with disabilities their whole lives, who feel marginalized, these are folks who are highly suspicious about the idea that government may be nudging people to a certain end. And that's something that legislators, I think we can understand, are really reluctant to get in the middle of. That is a very difficult discussion. It's an important one. I think it's ones that, as we get older, we all think about from time to time. But that's something I think the legislature just decided, my head's going to explode if I do one more hard thing this year. And that one gets pushed to the bottom of the list, most years for that reason.
Speaking of hard things, Jan, before we run out of time, when we talked about climate around the Transportation and Climate Initiative, we didn't get a chance to get into the fact that other climate issues were taken up by the legislature, some actually moved by the legislature. Was this something that you saw Connecticut lawmakers taking more seriously this year around, actually passing some climate adaptation legislation?
Honestly, I think that legislation just got thrown in the mix and passed through, but it makes a very important point because the adaptation legislation went through, the mitigation didn't, but the adaptation was going to help on a financial front. It increased the scope of the Green Bank, and the Green Bank it doesn't take any general fund money. For every buck it gets, it makes 8 to 10 more. And has this notion of investment to make money, which is something that I wanted to note. The state doesn't always, pardon the pun, buy into. It also allowed for water authorities, where communities, if they want to do them, they can raise money. Again, it takes the onus off the budget. It's not huge amounts of money. And there was another small version of that as well. But it gets to the point of the use of environmental initiatives, whether it's waste components, whether it's climate change or energy build outs, as an economic driver for jobs, for tax revenue, for, you know, everything that Wall Street looks at, especially in the face of climate change, which, as I'm fond of saying, you know, you don't take care of that, you forget about everything else. Um, this state has, in the years I've been covering this, has always just been so reluctant to do that. Other states have beaten them to the head of the line. You know, New York and Massachusetts are light years ahead. You know, there's not a day goes by I don't get a press release out of New York State with some amazing program they're cooking out. And we tend to be following along on that front. TCI would have done that too. It would have, you know, really pushed the economic development in. So, you know, we're back to think long term. You're not going to get the money tomorrow. You will get it down the road. But if you don't do anything, you won't get anything.
I can see, because of the way that this works, that Mark is actually typing an answer to the last question I wanted to ask that Alex Knopp was asking him, which is, what changes do you expect to be made to the current paradigm of emergency health powers allotted to the governor? One of the many reasons it was a strange session, Paz, is it started in the middle of a pandemic. By the end, it was, I don't know, kind of normal. But the weirdest thing about this year was that an awful lot of the state was just being run by the governor of the state, and the legislature was somewhat cut out. That's something that caused some consternation, not only amongst the legislature, but amongst a lot of other people. Does that change in the future, do you think?
I think legislators are going to lose a lot of interest about this topic unless the pandemic rebounds. There will be some lawmakers who will pursue it. They did some minor tweaks in the final renewal of the governor's powers. They created a new oversight provision where legislature can come in a little bit quicker. Legislature always had that option. You know, this has certainly been a learning experience, you know, an extraordinary period. But again, if the governor doesn't keep issuing executive orders and there isn't the need, you know, I'm guessing by and large this will recede. It's just, again, it's human nature.
Keith, a last thing for you. What's something right now, as this legislative session ends, state budget passed, what do you look at as a reporter that's the next thing that you are watching for as we look ahead toward the next time lawmakers convene in Hartford?
I'm going to start to see them laying out the seeds of a potential reelection budget. I know Governor Lamont has not announced yet what he's doing, but I've been following budgets for about 30 years, and everything so far has been to position himself, as you would expect, to run for reelection. I think he's going to have to come up with a good message if he's going to try to, next February, try to offer some tax relief that doesn't necessarily benefit the same communities that were begging for it and got turned down this past session. But I think he's going to want to try to offer something next February that's very broad-based. And that's what I'll be watching for.
And important to note, Paz, that this, you know, it's very real that all these things do happen within a political environment. And yes, the next elections are just around the corner.
He's well positioned. And, you know, unless a strong candidate really came out of nowhere to challenge him in a primary, I think he'll be able to resist pressures on tax reform next year. If he's reelected, I think you're going to see a hard push because it's going to coincide with the end of the federal dollars. And then the question will, you know, the pressure will be there to do something. But, you know, he's been pushed to the center by the left and by the right. And that's where he is at his most comfortable. So again, it's hard to imagine somebody emerging with less than a year to challenge him for the Democratic nomination, particularly when you look at the fact he does not have to worry about, you know, raising money. So there will be some grumbling on the left about his stubbornness when it comes to taxes. But when it comes to reelection, you know, you have the Senate Republican leaders saying things like the governor certainly stood tall on taxes. So in a general election, you know, that's not a bad place to be. If he can avoid a Democratic primary where that's certainly a liability, you know, he should be fine.
Mark Pazniokas is the Capitol Bureau Chief. Keith Phaneuf is the state budget reporter. Jen Ellen Spiegel is the environmental reporter for the Connecticut Mirror. I want to thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it.
It was fun.
Thanks, John.
Anytime.
And if for some reason you wanted to watch this event again, and you could watch it start to finish in just a couple of days. We're going to have it up on our website, ctmirror.org/events. I will just do a quick promo here. Then the next couple of weeks, we've got a couple more events like this next week, next Tuesday at the same time, navigating truth in a changing media landscape. We're going to be talking about assessing fact and fiction in the current media landscape, which is very unusual. Let's just put it that way. We'll be joined by Marie Shanahan from UConn and some other experts from around the state and around the country. You can join us for that and sign up for it at ctmirror.org/events. And then 2 weeks from tonight, I'm sitting down once again with Linda Greenhouse, the longtime reporter covering the Supreme Court. She's a Connecticut resident, and she is always willing to sit down and talk with us about the Supreme Court term. And it has been another interesting one, to say the least. That's on July 6th at 7 p.m. You can join us there again, ctmirror.org/events. That's where you can sign up. The last thing I'll say is, in the upper right-hand button in the corner there, ctmirror.org, there's a little button that says donate. You can support nonprofit journalism by clicking on that button and making a donation today. That's how these reporters are able to do the work that they do. It's how the Mirror is able to do everything it's done for you for more than 10 years. So consider a contribution if you haven't already. If you have supported the Mirror in the past, thank you so much. Thanks for spending some time with us on a somewhat rainy summer evening, and we'll talk to you soon.